The morning of September 8, 2022, started like any other day for Sergeant James Morrison of the Queen's Guard. He had been serving in the elite regiment for 12 years, and discipline was second nature to him. Every button polished, every crease sharp, every movement precise. The Queen's Guard didn't just protect the monarchy, they embodied it through their unwavering dedication to protocol. James had always been proud of his position. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and other royal residences wasn't just a job, it was an honor passed down through generations. His grandfather had served during World War II, and his father had been part of the Guard during the turbulent 1970s. The Morrison family understood duty, sacrifice, and the weight of tradition. That Thursday morning, however, everything changed. The news came through official channels first, then spread like wildfire through the barracks. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II had passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. At 96 years old, she had been the longest reigning British monarch in history. Having served for over 70 years, James felt the world shift beneath his feet. The Queen wasn't just his sovereign, she had been a constant presence throughout his entire life. Born in 1985, he had never known a Briton without Elizabeth II on the throne. She had been there during his childhood, his military training, his wedding, and the birth of his children. Now suddenly she was gone. The immediate aftermath was a blur of activity. Operation London Bridge, the carefully planned protocol for the Queen's death, swung into action. Every detail had been rehearsed countless times, from the official announcements to the placement of flowers outside royal residences. The Queen's Guard had their own specific role to play in this historic moment. Within hours, thousands of people began gathering outside Buckingham Palace. They came in waves, young and old, tourists and locals, some crying openly, others standing in stunned silence. The iconic black railings became a shrine of flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. "Thank you, ma'am," read one simple message tied to a bouquet of white roses. James and his fellow guards were tasked with maintaining order and security during this unprecedented outpouring of grief. They stood at their posts, stoic and professional, as the crowd grew larger and more emotional. Children placed teddy bears against the palace gates. Elderly veterans saluted with tears streaming down their faces. Foreign visitors who barely spoke English somehow found the words to express their sorrow. The atmosphere was unlike anything James had experienced. During his years of service, he had witnessed many significant events: royal weddings, state visits, jubilee celebrations. But this felt different. There was a raw vulnerability in the air, a collective sense that something irreplaceable had been lost. As the days passed, the magnitude of what was coming became clear. The Queen's funeral would be one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in history. Presidents, prime ministers, kings, and queens from across the globe would attend. The logistics alone were staggering: security arrangements, transportation, accommodation for millions of mourners expected to line the streets of London. James received his assignment on the Friday following the Queen's death. He would be part of the ceremonial guard during the funeral procession from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch. It was an incredible honor, but also an enormous responsibility. The entire world would be watching, and every aspect of the ceremony had to be perfect. The training intensified immediately. Every step of the procession was mapped out and rehearsed. The guards practiced their movements until they could perform them flawlessly, even under the pressure of global scrutiny. James had participated in many ceremonial events, but nothing on this scale. During the preparation, he learned more about the Queen's remarkable life and reign. She had ascended to the throne at just 25 years old, following her father's unexpected death. She had navigated the country through decades of change: the end of empire, the digital revolution, wars, economic crises, and social transformation. Through it all, she had remained a symbol of stability and continuity. The personal stories shared by older members of the Guard were particularly moving. Some had served during the Queen's earlier years and remembered her as a young woman, still adjusting to the weight of the crown. Others recalled her warmth during private moments, her genuine interest in their welfare, her remarkable memory for names and faces. Her unexpected sense of humor. James began to understand that this funeral wasn't just a state occasion. It was a deeply personal farewell for millions of people. The Queen had been grandmother, mother, and constant companion to a nation. Her death marked the end of an era in the most literal sense. As the weekend approached, London transformed. The queue to see the Queen's coffin as she lay in state at Westminster Hall stretched for miles along the Thames. People waited for up to 24 hours, carrying camping chairs and thermoses, sharing stories and memories with strangers who became temporary friends. The collective patience and respect shown by the mourners was extraordinary. James found himself thinking about his own relationship with duty and service. The Queen had dedicated her entire adult life to her role, never retiring, never stepping back, never putting personal comfort before public responsibility. She had shown up day after day, year after year, providing stability and reassurance to generations of subjects. The Guards, in their own way, embodied those same values. They stood in all weather, remained alert during long hours, and maintained their composure regardless of personal circumstances. It was a tradition of service that connected them directly to the monarch they protected. On Sunday evening, as James prepared his uniform for the funeral, he felt the weight of history. Tomorrow he would help carry the Queen on her final journey as sovereign. After the funeral, Britain would have a new king and life would continue. But this moment, this final act of service to Elizabeth II, would be remembered forever. The black uniform was immaculate, every piece of brass gleaming. His boots were polished to mirror perfection. The ceremonial sword hung precisely at his side. As he stood before the mirror, James saw not just himself, but generations of guards who had served before him. Tomorrow, he would honor them all. Monday, September 19th, 2022, dawned gray and solemn over London. The city had been preparing for this day for over a week, but nothing could have prepared its residents for the sheer scale of what was about to unfold. James Morrison woke at 4:30 a.m., though he had barely slept. The weight of the day ahead pressed on his mind like a heavy blanket. The barracks were unusually quiet as the Guards prepared for the most significant ceremony of their careers. Every man moved with purposeful precision, checking and double-checking their uniforms, equipment, and ceremonial weapons. There was little conversation. Each guard understood the gravity of what lay ahead. James had performed countless ceremonial duties, but today felt different from the moment he opened his eyes. The Queen's funeral would be broadcast to an estimated 4 billion people worldwide, more than half the global population. Presidents, prime ministers, and royalty from 200 countries would attend. The security operation was the largest in British history, with thousands of police officers, military personnel, and intelligence agents working together. As James dressed, he thought about the woman they were honoring. Queen Elizabeth II had been more than a monarch. She had been a constant in an ever-changing world. She had reigned through 15 different prime ministers. From Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, she had seen the British Empire transform into the Commonwealth, witnessed the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the digital revolution. The morning briefing was thorough and precise. Every guard knew exactly where to stand, when to move, and how to respond to various scenarios. The route from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch had been measured to the inch. Timing was critical. The procession had to move at exactly the right pace to reach each checkpoint on schedule. James's position placed him near the gun carriage that would carry the Queen's coffin. The state gun carriage of the Royal Navy, drawn by 142 sailors, would bear Her Majesty on her final journey through London. It was the same gun carriage that had carried her father, King George VI, and would now complete the circle of royal tradition. The early morning hours were spent in final preparations. The guards assembled in formation, each man a perfect representation of British military tradition. Their red tunics and black bearskin hats were icons recognized around the world, symbols of an institution that had protected the crown for centuries. As they marched to their positions, James could see the crowds already gathering despite the early hour. People lined every street along the funeral route, many having camped overnight to secure the best viewing spots. The atmosphere was respectful but electric with anticipation. This was history in the making, and everyone present seemed to understand they were witnessing something that would be remembered for generations. Westminster Abbey filled with the world's most powerful leaders. President Biden sat near Emperor Naruhito of Japan. King Philippe of Spain was close to President Macron of France. Despite their different languages, cultures, and political systems, they were united in paying respect to a woman who had embodied dignity and service for 7 decades. James took his position as the morning progressed. The September air was crisp, carrying the scent of flowers from the thousands of bouquets placed throughout London. Church bells rang across the city, their solemn tolling marking the passage of time toward the ceremony's beginning. The Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, the orb and the scepter, was a sight that took James's breath away. These were symbols he had protected and honored throughout his career, but seeing them together on the Queen's final journey created an emotional response he hadn't expected. Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby led the service with words that captured the nation's feelings. People of loving service are rare in any walk of life. Leaders of loving service are still rarer, but in all cases, those who serve will be loved and remembered when those who cling to power and privileges are forgotten. The music was haunting and beautiful. The congregation sang "The Lord's My Shepherd" and "Love Divine," all loves excelling hymns that had been sung at the Queen's wedding in 1947. The sound of nearly 2,000 voices raised in unison created an atmosphere of reverence that even the most hardened guards found moving. During the service, James found himself thinking about the Queen's remarkable life. She had married the love of her life, Prince Philip, and remained devoted to him for over 70 years until his death in 2021. She had raised 4 children while carrying the weight of the crown. She had modernized the monarchy while preserving its essential traditions. The Queen had also shown remarkable personal courage. During World War II, as Princess Elizabeth, she had insisted on serving her country, training as a driver and mechanic in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She had faced down intruders in her bedroom at Buckingham Palace, dealt with family scandals with grace, and continued working well into her 90s. As the service concluded, the congregation stood in silence. The moment had arrived for the Queen to leave Westminster Abbey for the final time. The silence was profound, not just inside the ancient church, but throughout London and across the Commonwealth realms where millions watched in respectful quiet. The bearer party, consisting of grenadier guards, carefully lifted the coffin and began the slow walk toward the great west door. Each step was measured and deliberate. These young men carried not just the Queen's remains, but the hopes, memories, and gratitude of an entire nation. James felt his training take over as the procession began to form. Every movement was automatic, honed through years of practice and centuries of tradition. Yet beneath the professional exterior, he was deeply moved by the significance of the moment. This was more than ceremony. It was the final act in one of the most remarkable reigns in British history. The sound of military bands began to fill the air as the procession prepared to move. The haunting melody of funeral march, played by some of the world's finest military musicians, provided a soundtrack to history. Thousands of servicemen and women lined the route, representing every branch of the British military and forces from across the Commonwealth. As the Queen's coffin emerged from Westminster Abbey into the grey London morning, a collective intake of breath seemed to rise from the watching millions. This was the moment when pageantry met profound human emotion, when ancient tradition carried the weight of contemporary grief. The procession was about to begin, and James Morrison, along with his fellow guards, would play their part in ensuring that Queen Elizabeth II received the farewell she deserved, one worthy of a woman who had given her life in service to others. The procession began to move with clockwork precision through the streets of London. James Morrison marched alongside the gun carriage, his boots keeping perfect time with the slow, measured beat of the funeral drums. Every step had been rehearsed dozens of times, but nothing could have prepared him for the emotional reality of this moment. The crowds lining the streets were unlike anything he had ever experienced. People stood 10 deep behind the barriers, many holding flowers, photos of the Queen, or small Union Jack flags. What struck James most was the absolute silence. Despite hundreds of thousands of people watching, the only sounds were the steady beat of drums, the clip-clop of horses' hooves, and the rolling wheels of the gun carriage on ancient London stone. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, their young faces solemn with an understanding that something monumentally important was happening. Elderly veterans stood at attention, their chests heavy with medals earned in conflicts spanning decades. Foreign visitors wept openly, caught up in the raw emotion of the moment despite having no personal connection to Britain beyond this shared human experience of loss. As the procession moved along Whitehall, James caught glimpses of the incredible floral tributes that had transformed London into a garden of remembrance. Every spare space along the route was filled with flowers, roses, lilac, chrysanthemums, and simple wildflowers picked by children. Handwritten cards fluttered in the gentle breeze. "Thank you for your service. Rest in peace, Your Majesty. You will be missed." The international presence was staggering. James could see foreign military attaches in their ceremonial uniforms, diplomats from every corner of the world, and representatives of organizations the Queen had patronized throughout her long reign. This wasn't just Britain saying goodbye. It was the entire world paying its respects to a woman who had transcended national boundaries to become a global symbol of stability and grace. King Charles III followed directly behind his mother's coffin, his face a mask of controlled emotion. The new monarch had waited his entire life for this moment, not the funeral, but the responsibility that would follow. At 73, he was finally king, but the crown had come at the ultimate price. Beside him walked his sons, William and Harry. Their previous conflicts set aside in the face of their shared grief. The Queen consort, Camilla, rode in a car behind the walking royals, her face pale but composed. Catherine, now the Princess of Wales, sat with her children George and Charlotte, explaining in whispered tones what was happening around them. 9-year-old George would one day be king himself, and this ceremony was his first real glimpse of the weight that would eventually rest on his shoulders. As they passed the cenotaph, Britain's memorial to the war dead, James felt the historical weight of the moment intensify. The Queen had laid wreaths at this very spot for decades, honoring the fallen from 2 world wars and countless other conflicts. Now she herself was being honored. Having served her country with the same dedication as those remembered in stone, the crowds had been gathering since before dawn, but their patience and respect were remarkable. Despite the massive numbers, there was no pushing or shoving, no inappropriate behavior. People seemed to understand instinctively that they were part of something sacred. Strangers shared umbrellas when light rain began to fall. Elderly people were helped to better viewing positions by younger attendees. It was Britain at its best, orderly, compassionate, and united in purpose. James noticed details that would stay with him forever. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, had drawn a picture of the Queen with crayons and held it up as the coffin passed. An elderly man in a wheelchair, wearing his military medals, saluted with tears streaming down his face. A group of Commonwealth immigrants stood together, their various national flags draped over their shoulders, united in their respect for the woman who had presided over their adoption into British society. The television cameras captured everything, but they couldn't convey the emotional atmosphere that enveloped the procession. There was something almost mystical about the collective reverence of so many people gathered for a single purpose. It reminded James of why he had chosen to serve in the Queen's Guard. There was something noble about being part of an institution bigger than oneself. As they approached Horse Guards Parade, James could see more of the incredible security operations surrounding the funeral. Snipers were positioned on rooftops, their outlines barely visible against the gray sky. Police officers lined every intersection, and military personnel were stationed at strategic points throughout the route. Yet despite the massive security presence, the atmosphere remained one of celebration of life rather than fear of threats. The international media coverage was unprecedented. Reporters from every major news organization in the world lined the route, providing commentary in dozens of languages. This was the most-watched funeral in television history. Reaching an audience larger than the Olympics or World Cup, the Queen's final journey was bringing the world together in a way that few events ever could. James found himself thinking about the Queen's own words about service. "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." She had spoken those words on her 21st birthday in 1947, and she had kept that promise every day until her death. 75 years later, the procession moved through Parliament Square, past the Houses of Parliament where the Queen had opened Parliament annually for 7 decades. She had worked with 15 different prime ministers, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, providing continuity and stability through decades of political change. The building stood silent today, its flags at half-mast, as if acknowledging the end of an era. Ahead lay Wellington Arch, where the Queen's coffin would be transferred to the state hearse for the final journey to Windsor Castle. But first, they had to complete this historic procession through the heart of London, carrying the Queen past the landmarks that had defined her reign and the people who had been touched by her life of service. The weight of the moment was not lost on James. He was playing a small but significant part in one of the most important ceremonies in British history. Every step he took, every breath he drew, was being witnessed by billions of people around the world. It was both humbling and inspiring, a reminder of the power of tradition and the importance of duty. As the procession approached Wellington Arch, James Morrison felt the weight of the moment intensifying with each measured step. The final phase of the Queen's journey through London was about to begin, and with it, his part in this historic farewell would soon be complete. The crowds here were even denser, packed shoulder to shoulder behind the barriers, creating a wall of silent reverence that stretched as far as the eye could see. The atmosphere had shifted subtly as they moved through central London. While Westminster had felt formal and official, this part of the route felt more personal. Many of the spectators here were locals, people who lived and worked near Buckingham Palace, who had seen the Queen regularly over the years, who felt a personal connection to the woman passing by one final time. James noticed an elderly woman in the front row clutching a photograph of herself meeting the Queen decades earlier. The black and white image showed a much younger woman shaking hands with a radiant Queen Elizabeth, both of them smiling broadly. Now, tears streamed down the elderly woman's weathered face as she held the memory up like an offering, a small piece of her own history, intertwined with the monarch's remarkable life. The gun carriage moved with mechanical precision, its wheels turning slowly on the London asphalt. The 142 sailors who pulled it moved in perfect synchronization, their white naval uniforms stark against the gray morning. This was the same carriage that had carried the Queen's father, King George VI, to his final rest, creating a poignant link between generations of royal farewells. James had studied the history of royal funerals during his preparation for this day. Queen Victoria's funeral in 1901 had been the first to capture global attention, with representatives from across the British Empire attending. King George V's funeral in 1936 had been broadcast on radio to millions. But nothing in British history compared to the scale and reach of today's ceremony. The silence of the crowds was broken only by the occasional sob or whispered prayer. Children, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it, stood quietly beside their parents. Dogs seemed to sense the solemnity, sitting calmly despite the unusual crowds and activity. Even the city's famous pigeons appeared subdued, perched motionlessly on nearby buildings. As they passed Hyde Park Corner, James could see the preparations already underway at Wellington Arch. The state hearse waited there, ready to carry the Queen on her final journey to Windsor Castle, where she would be buried beside her beloved husband, Prince Philip. The transfer from gun carriage to hearse would mark another transition in this carefully choreographed farewell. Behind the royal family, James could see the international dignitaries who had traveled from every corner of the globe. President Biden walked alongside Emperor Naruhito of Japan, their different backgrounds and political systems united in respect for the woman they had come to honor. The sight of former adversaries and current allies walking together in peace was perhaps one of the Queen's final gifts to the world, a demonstration of the diplomatic bridges she had built over 7 decades. The Queen had been a master of what diplomats called soft power, the ability to influence through attraction rather than coercion. She had hosted countless world leaders at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, using royal hospitality to ease tensions and build relationships. Her famous tea diplomacy had resolved conflicts and created friendships that lasted decades. James remembered reading about some of her most challenging diplomatic moments. She had welcomed Nelson Mandela to the palace despite opposition from her own government, recognizing his moral authority before many politicians did. She had invited former IRA members to royal events as part of the peace process in Northern Ireland. She had maintained relationships with Commonwealth leaders, even as the empire transformed into a voluntary association of nations. The procession was approaching the moment James had been both anticipating and dreading. Soon, his formal role in the Queen's funeral would end, but he already knew this day would stay with him forever. Every detail was burning itself into his memory: the sound of the drums, the silence of the crowds, the weight of history being made with each step. Around him, his fellow guards maintained their professional composure, but James could see the emotion in their eyes. These were men who had dedicated their lives to protecting the monarchy, and today they were saying goodbye to the monarch who had defined their entire careers. Some had served under the Queen for decades, witnessing her transformation from a young woman to the world's most experienced head of state. The Queen's relationship with her guards had always been special. She knew many of them by name, asked about their families, and showed genuine interest in their welfare. Stories circulated in the barracks about her kindness, how she had once invited a guard inside for tea during a particularly cold winter night, how she remembered details about their children's lives, how she always showed appreciation for their service. One story that particularly resonated with James was about a guard who had fainted during a ceremony in the blazing summer heat. When he came to, he found the Queen herself fanning him with her program, her face full of concern. "Are you quite all right?" she had asked, her voice carrying genuine worry. That guard had served for 30 more years, inspired by that moment of royal compassion. As they drew closer to Wellington Arch, James could see the magnificent memorial ahead. Built to commemorate the Duke of Wellington's victory at Waterloo, it now served as a fitting landmark for the Queen's final departure from London. The arch had been witness to more than a century of British history, and today it would see one of the most significant moments in the nation's long story. The transfer to the state hearse would mark the end of the public procession and the beginning of the Queen's private journey to Windsor. There, in the peaceful grounds of Windsor Castle, surrounded by the history and traditions she had served so faithfully, Queen Elizabeth II would finally find her rest beside the man she had loved for more than 7 decades. But before that quiet conclusion, there remained this final public moment, the last time the people of Britain would see their Queen, the last chapter in a story that had captivated the world for the better part of a century. James Morrison was honored to be part of writing that final chapter, to help carry the Queen on her last journey as sovereign, and to represent the best traditions of service and duty that she had embodied throughout her remarkable reign. The procession reached Wellington Arch, and James Morrison felt his heart rate quicken as they approached this crucial moment in the ceremony. Everything had proceeded flawlessly so far, but the transfer of the Queen's coffin from the gun carriage to the state hearse required absolute precision. Millions of eyes around the world were watching, and there was no room for error. The arch stood majestically against the gray September sky, its classical columns and triumphant sculpture providing a fitting backdrop for this historic moment. The crowds gathered here were even more densely packed than anywhere else along the route, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere of reverent silence. As the gun carriage came to its final stop, James took his position with the other guards. The moment they had rehearsed countless times was about to become reality. The bearer party from the Grenadier Guards approached the coffin with measured steps, their movements synchronized to perfection. After weeks of intensive preparation, it was at this moment that something unexpected happened, something that would later be discussed and analyzed by royal watchers around the world. James noticed it first, a small commotion in the crowd near the barriers. An elderly man in a wheelchair, wearing a military beret and chest full of medals, was struggling to see over the people standing in front of him. The man appeared to be a veteran, perhaps from World War II or one of the post-war conflicts. His weathered hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair, and his eyes were fixed desperately on the Queen's coffin. It was clear that this moment meant everything to him, a final chance to pay his respects to the sovereign he had served decades earlier. Protocol dictated that James should remain in formation, eyes forward, maintaining the perfect discipline that had made the Queen's Guard legendary worldwide. Every manual, every training session, every tradition emphasized the importance of unwavering focus during ceremonial duties. The guards were taught to ignore distractions, weather, discomfort, and even personal emotions, but something about the elderly veteran's situation touched James deeply. Perhaps it was the man's obvious distress, or the way his trembling hand kept reaching toward the distant coffin. Perhaps it was the recognition that this veteran represented thousands of servicemen who had sworn the same oath of loyalty that James had taken when he joined the Guard. In a split second that felt like an eternity, James made a decision that would define his career and capture hearts around the world. Breaking from his rigid formation, he stepped quietly to his left, creating a small gap in the line of guards. The movement was subtle but significant. It opened a clear line of sight between the elderly veteran and the Queen's coffin. The veteran's face transformed the moment he realized what had happened. His watery eyes widened, and a smile of pure gratitude spread across his weathered features. He raised his right hand in a trembling salute, holding it steady despite his obvious physical frailty. For perhaps 30 seconds, this old soldier had his moment with his Queen, a final farewell after a lifetime of service. James's movement hadn't gone unnoticed by his superior officers, but surprisingly, none of them corrected his position. Perhaps they too understood the significance of the moment, or perhaps they were moved by the same human compassion that had motivated James's action. The breach of protocol was minor in practical terms, but enormous in its symbolic meaning. The veteran wasn't the only one who noticed. Several people in the crowd had seen James's subtle movement, and word began to spread quietly through the assembled mourners. In an age of social media and instant communication, someone captured the moment on their phone, though the full significance wouldn't be understood until later. The bearer party completed their solemn task, lifting the Queen's coffin from the gun carriage with the reverence and precision that had characterized the entire ceremony. The imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter remained in perfect position atop the royal standard, symbols of authority that would soon pass to King Charles III. As the coffin was placed into the state hearse, James returned to his proper position in formation. The brief moment of individual action was over, and he was once again part of the collective tradition that had served the monarchy for centuries. But something had changed, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed his small act of kindness. The Queen's corgis, Sandy and Muick, waited at Windsor Castle, unaware that their beloved owner would never return to walk with them through the castle grounds. The Queen's love for her dogs had been one of her most endearing qualities, a reminder of her humanity behind the crown and ceremony. King Charles III approached the state hearse to place a handwritten note on top of his mother's coffin. The private message, known only to him, represented the personal grief hidden behind the public ceremony. The new king had lost not just his sovereign but his mother, and the weight of both losses was evident in his careful, deliberate movements. The crowds began to thin slightly as the state hearse prepared to leave London for Windsor Castle. The public part of the Queen's final journey was nearly complete, but the memory of what had transpired would linger long after the last mourner had gone home. James's simple act of stepping aside had reminded everyone present that even in the most formal circumstances, human compassion could still find a way to express itself. As the hearse pulled away from Wellington Arch, James felt a profound sense of completion mixed with anticipation of what would follow. His role in the funeral ceremony was essentially finished, but he knew that his small departure from protocol would likely have consequences. Whether those consequences would be positive or negative remained to be seen. The international media had captured every moment of the ceremony, and James's action would soon be analyzed and discussed around the world. Some would see it as a touching display of humanity, while others might view it as an inappropriate breach of military discipline. But for James, the decision had been simple. Sometimes doing the right thing mattered more than following rules. The veteran in the wheelchair had been helped away by family members, his final salute to the Queen complete. His face had shown a peace and satisfaction that suggested James's small kindness had provided exactly what was needed. Moment of connection with the sovereign he had served so faithfully decades earlier. As the mourners began to disperse and the ceremonial formations prepared to march away from Wellington Arch, James Morrison carried with him the knowledge that he had been part of something truly historic. The Queen's funeral had been flawless in its execution and profound in its emotional impact. His tiny deviation from protocol had added a human touch to the perfect pageantry, creating a moment that would be remembered long after the formal speeches were forgotten. The hours following the Queen's departure from Wellington Arch were filled with a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration for James Morrison. As the crowds slowly dispersed and London began to return to something approaching normalcy, he found himself reflecting on the extraordinary day and the decision that had felt so natural in the moment, but now seemed to loom larger with each passing hour. Back at the barracks, the atmosphere was subdued but proud. The Queen's Guard had executed their role in the funeral flawlessly, maintaining the standards of excellence that had made them legendary worldwide. Every guard had performed their duties with precision and dignity, contributing to a ceremony that would be remembered as one of the most moving and perfectly orchestrated events in modern history. James's fellow guards were sharing their own experiences from the day. Sergeant Williams spoke about seeing foreign dignitaries weeping openly during the service. Corporal Thompson described the incredible silence of the crowds, how hundreds of thousands of people had shown such respect that you could hear the clip-clop of individual horses' hooves on the pavement, but James noticed that several of his colleagues kept glancing at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Word of his brief departure from formation had spread through the ranks, though details remained unclear to most. Some seemed curious, others appeared concerned about potential repercussions, and a few showed what looked like quiet admiration. The first indication that his action had attracted wider attention came from an unexpected source. James's mobile phone, which had been switched off during the ceremony, buzzed with an unusual number of messages when he finally turned it on that evening. Friends, family members, and even acquaintances he hadn't heard from in years were reaching out to ask about something they had seen or heard about. His sister, Sarah, was the first to explain what was happening. "Jamie, there's a video going viral on social media. Someone filmed you stepping aside to help that old veteran see the Queen's coffin. People are calling it one of the most touching moments of the entire funeral. Are you in trouble?" James felt his stomach drop. Going viral was not something any member of the Queen's Guard aspired to achieve. Their role was to blend seamlessly into the background of royal ceremonies, to be part of the pageantry without becoming the focus of attention. Individual guards were meant to be anonymous components of a larger tradition, not social media sensations. Within hours, the video had been viewed millions of times across various platforms. The footage, shot on someone's phone from the crowd, clearly showed James's subtle movement and the elderly veteran's grateful response. The moment had been brief and understated, but its emotional impact was undeniable. Comments poured in from around the world. People praised James's compassion and humanity, calling his action a perfect embodiment of the values the Queen herself had represented. Veterans organizations shared the video with messages of gratitude. Royal watchers analyzed every frame, debating whether his decision represented a breach of protocol or a beautiful expression of the Guard's true purpose. The story was picked up by major news outlets by Tuesday morning. The headlines varied, but the theme was consistent. Royal Guard's act of kindness captures hearts worldwide. Guardsman breaks protocol to help veteran see Queen's coffin. Human moment in perfect ceremony touches millions. James found himself in an impossible position. He was proud of what he had done. The elderly veteran's smile had confirmed that his decision was right on a human level. But he was also deeply concerned about the potential consequences for his career and the reputation of the Queen's Guard. Military discipline existed for good reasons, and exceptions, no matter how well-intentioned, could set dangerous precedents. The call to his commanding officer's office came Wednesday morning. Colonel Harrison was a veteran of the Queen's Guard himself, having served for over 30 years. His office walls were lined with photographs of royal ceremonies, state visits, and military honors, a lifetime dedicated to the traditions James had momentarily departed from. "Sergeant Morrison," the colonel began, his expression unreadable. "I suppose you know why you're here?" James stood at attention, prepared for whatever consequences his actions might bring. "Yes, sir. I understand I may have acted inappropriately during the funeral ceremony." "Inappropriately?" Colonel Harrison raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting choice of words. What exactly do you think you did wrong?" "I broke formation without orders, sir. I allowed personal judgment to override protocol during a ceremonial duty." The colonel was quiet for a long moment, studying James carefully. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II was watched by more people than any event in human history. The eyes of the world were on us, and the reputation of the Queen's Guard was at stake. In that context, how do you evaluate your decision? James chose his words carefully. "Sir, I believe my action was a minor technical violation of protocol, but I also believe it served the greater purpose of honoring both the Queen's memory and the service of those who had served before us." The veteran appeared to be a former serviceman who needed just a moment to pay his final respects. "A former serviceman who needed a moment to pay his respects," the colonel repeated slowly. "And you felt it was your place to provide that moment?" "In that instant, yes, sir. I felt it was what the Queen would have wanted." Colonel Harrison was quiet again, then surprised James by leaning back in his chair and smiling slightly. "Sergeant Morrison, in 30 years of service, I've seen guards maintain their positions through thunderstorms, fainting spells, and even medical emergencies. The discipline of the Queen's Guard is legendary because it has to be. But do you know what made Queen Elizabeth II such a remarkable sovereign?" James wasn't sure if the question was rhetorical, so he remained silent. "Her Majesty understood that rules and protocols exist to serve people, not the other way around. Throughout her reign, she showed that true leadership sometimes requires knowing when to bend without breaking, when to show mercy with injustice, when to put humanity above procedure." The colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground where guards were drilling in preparation for future ceremonies. "The video of your action has been viewed over 50 million times. Veterans organizations are praising the Queen's Guard for showing the same compassion their sovereign demonstrated throughout her reign. The palace has received hundreds of letters thanking us for that moment of kindness." James felt relief beginning to wash over him, but he remained at attention, waiting for the full verdict. "However," the colonel continued, "we cannot have guards making individual decisions about protocol during ceremonies. The success of our operations depends on everyone following orders precisely." "Yes, sir. I understand completely. Which is why," Colonel Harrison turned back to face him, "I am recommending you for a commendation for exemplary service during Her Majesty's funeral. Your instinctive understanding of what the moment required, while maintaining the dignity and precision expected of the Queen's Guard, represents the finest traditions of our regiment." James was speechless. A commendation was the last thing he had expected after breaking protocol on the world's biggest stage, 6 months after Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. Sergeant James Morrison stood in the same parade ground where he had drilled countless times, but this day was different. King Charles III himself was present to award commendations to members of the military who had served with distinction during his mother's funeral. The ceremony was smaller and more intimate than the global spectacle of September, but no less meaningful for those involved. James had spent the intervening months dealing with the unexpected fame his moment of compassion had brought him. The video of his action had become one of the most watched clips from the entire funeral coverage, shared across social media platforms and featured in documentaries about the Queen's final farewell. He had received thousands of messages from people around the world, many from veterans who saw his gesture as recognition of their own service. The attention had been overwhelming at times. News outlets had sought interviews, which James had politely declined on advice from his superiors. The Queen's Guard maintained traditions of discretion and anonymity, and individual guards traditionally avoided public attention. But the public's response to his actions had been so overwhelmingly positive that the regiment had decided to make an exception for this recognition ceremony. Among the messages James had received, one stood out above all others. It had come from the family of the elderly veteran he had helped that day at Wellington Arch. The man's name was Arthur Pemberton, aged 95, a former Royal Navy sailor who had served during the later stages of World War II and throughout the Cold War. Arthur had passed away peacefully in his sleep, just 2 months after the funeral, but not before expressing to his family how much that final moment with his queen had meant to him. Arthur's daughter, Margaret, had written to James with details that brought tears to his eyes. "My father spoke about your kindness every day after the funeral. He said that in all his years of service, he had never experienced such a perfect example of one serviceman honoring another. You gave him exactly what he needed, a chance to say goodbye properly to the sovereign he had served for over 40 years. He died happy, and your small act of humanity was a large part of that peace." The letter continued with information about Arthur's remarkable life. He had joined the Royal Navy at 17, serving on destroyers that protected Atlantic convoys. After the war, he had remained in service through the Suez Crisis, the Falklands conflict, and various Cold War tensions. He had met Queen Elizabeth II twice, once when she visited his ship in 1955, and again when he received his Long Service Medal in 1985. "Dad always said the Queen remembered him from their first meeting," Margaret had written. When she presented his medal 30 years later, she asked about his service on HMS Cavalier and whether he still enjoyed sailing. He was amazed that she recalled such details about a junior sailor from decades earlier. "That's the kind of person she was. And that's why your gesture meant so much to him." The story of Arthur Pemberton had reinforced for James that his decision at Wellington Arch had been about more than protocol or publicity. It had been about recognizing the connection between past and present, between different generations of service, between the individual and the institution they served. Arthur's final salute had represented the gratitude of countless servicemen and women who had served under the Queen's long reign. Now, as King Charles III approached to present the commendation, James felt the weight of that responsibility. The king paused before him, his eyes reflecting both the grief of losing his mother and the pride of beginning his own reign. "Sergeant Morrison," the king said, his voice carrying the same measured cadence that had marked his mother's public speaking, "your actions during my mother's funeral exemplified the finest traditions of service and compassion that she championed throughout her reign. In showing kindness to a veteran who needed that moment of connection, you demonstrated that true discipline includes the wisdom to know when human compassion should guide our actions." The king pinned the commendation to James's uniform, then stepped back and offered something unexpected, a personal comment not part of the formal ceremony. "My mother would have been proud of what you did that day. She always believed that our duty was to serve others, and you served that elderly gentleman when he needed it most." James felt the profound truth in those words. Queen Elizabeth II had indeed believed in service above all else. Her famous promise on her 21st birthday to dedicate her life to service had not been mere rhetoric, it had been a commitment she had honored every day until her death. In a small way, James had honored that same commitment when he stepped aside to help Arthur Pemberton see his queen one final time. After the ceremony, James was approached by several other veterans who had attended as guests. They shared their own stories of meeting the Queen, of moments when her personal kindness had touched their lives in ways that went far beyond ceremonial duty. An elderly woman told him about the Queen's visit to her husband's military hospital, where she had spent extra time talking with wounded soldiers. A retired police officer described how the Queen had remembered his children's names when she met him again years later. These stories painted a picture of a monarch who understood that true leadership meant caring about individuals, not just institutions. The Queen's legendary memory for faces and names, her genuine interest in people's lives, her ability to make even brief encounters feel meaningful, these qualities had made her remarkable, not just as a sovereign, but as a human being. In the months that followed, James continued his duties with the Queen's Guard under King Charles III. The routines remained largely the same: ceremonial duties, security responsibilities, the endless drilling that maintained their reputation for precision and excellence. But something had changed in how James approached his service. He understood now that following orders and maintaining discipline were important, but so was maintaining the human connections that gave those duties meaning. The story of his action at the Queen's funeral continued to resonate around the world. It had been included in several documentaries about the Queen's life and legacy, always presented as an example of how her values of service and compassion had influenced those who served her. James occasionally received letters from people who had been inspired by the story, young soldiers who saw it as an example of how to balance duty with humanity, veterans who felt honored by his recognition of their service. Perhaps most importantly, James had learned that sometimes the most significant moments in life are the smallest ones. His decision to step aside had taken perhaps 30 seconds, but its impact had rippled out far beyond what he could have imagined. It had given Arthur Pemberton a peaceful farewell, provided comfort to the veteran's family, and reminded millions of people watching around the world that compassion could coexist with discipline. Years later, when James would look back on his career with the Queens,